In this tutorial, we're going to look at using keyframes to control our animation in Toon Boom Harmony. Now, keyframes allow us much greater flexibility while we're working. So, if I start out with a similar shape that we've used before, I'm going to fill it with a transparent color. And I'm doing that because when I have a transparent color inside my artwork, and if I put it over something else, I can see it, such as an animation path or something, which we'll be doing a little bit later. Now, what we've done before when we want to animate this is we move to the next frame, we turn on onion skinning, and then we create our artwork. But I'm here to tell you that there's a better way. So the first thing I'm going to do is just expand out my timeline so it's a little bit longer, so I have some more time to work with, and turn off onion skinning because I don't want it on at the moment. And the tool that we're going to end up using predominantly is the transform tool. And the transform tool allows us to modify the properties of this drawing layer. But there's a couple things we have to take care of before we can animate this. The proper way to animate layers of artwork inside of Harmony is by using a peg layer. So we haven't looked at using peg layers before, but what a peg layer is think of it as a handle for one or more layers that we can then modify the position, scale, and rotation of those layers through that peg. So to add a peg to a layer with the drawing layer selected, the easy way is down in your timeline, with that layer active, if I just click on the add peg, we see it added a peg layer. Now, this drawing layer is a child of the peg layer. We can see that by the little arrow next to it. Now I can collapse this and look at just the peg layer, or I can see my drawing and the peg. Now, pegs don't get any artwork. Pegs store the keyframe information for our drawings. Now, it is possible to add keyframes to drawings and to pegs, but the proper way to use them as animators are working with them in studios right now is we use the peg on the peg layer, and that's where we want to, or use the keyframes with the peg layer. So this is where it's really going to help. First, on my drawing layer, I want to extend its exposure out to the very end. So I'll just click at the very end and hit the function key F5. And when I do that, we can see now my artwork, I grabbed the wrong thing. My artwork exists for all of it. Now it's not doing anything, but now we can move this around by using the peg. So I'm going to collapse my drawing layer so I just see the peg layer. And by default, Harmony will name a peg layer with a -P after it. So what I can do in frame 1 here is I click on that peg and I am going to insert a keyframe. Now I have a little button to do that down on my timeline. And it also shows me the function key F6 will do this as well. So with that selected, I hit F6 and it puts this little square in. That square indicates that this is a keyframe. Now, if I want to give this keyframe, or give this peg a different property on, say, frame 10, what I can do is use the transform tool. So we don't use the select tool. The select tool is only to be used when we are creating artwork, when we are drawing on our layers. Otherwise, we don't use it. So notice this is up at the top where we have the black arrow, the white arrow, the paintbrush, the pencil, the stamp, the eraser. All of these are content creation tools. They are not animation tools. So it's important we use the transform tool. This is an animation tool. So with that selected, I'm now at this next frame, and what I can do is, if I change this artwork, if I scale it, I rotate it, and we'll figure out why it's kind of rotating oddly right now. Or if I move it, it's moving based in relation to that peg. But now looking in my timeline, I should see a little line connecting these two keyframes. The black dots are keyframes. When it's selected, we can see now how we have that, and we have this transformation going on across time. Now I don't like that keyframe, so I'm going to click on the minus keyframe, make it go away. So we have the first frame here. Going back to why was it behaving weirdly? So if I rotate, you can see it's rotating around the center. By default, the pivot point or anchor point for a given layer is always going to be in the center of the screen. But if I draw my artwork off center, it's not aligned to that. So I have two options. One, I can move my artwork. Two, I can move the pivot point. And to move the pivot point permanently, we use the advanced animation tools. So under Windows toolbars, we need to make sure we're getting advanced animation showing up. Typically it's across the top. If it doesn't show up on your interface, in your top toolbar, right click and make sure that advanced animation has a check mark next to it. If not, select it and it will appear. These are the advanced animation tools. We have translate, rotate, and scale. Then also skew and maintain size. Those are the ones that we're going to care about. And the common tool that is recommended to change a pivot point is going to be with the rotate tool. Now if I click on the rotate tool, I can now move this pivot point. And if I move my cursor so it's over the pink and blue dot in the middle, we'll see it puts a little P next to it, and that indicates pivot point. Because if I go back to my transform tool, I can go over to that pivot point and it gets that there as well. But if I use the transform tool to move the pivot point, it will only move it on this keyframe. Once I click off this drawing layer and then click on it again, the pivot point will be back in its original location. So that is a problem. So to permanently adjust it, I use the rotate tool. I put my cursor over it so I get the little P next to it, and now I take and move this down. Now if I wanted it to rotate around its bottom here, now when we rotate we can see how it rotates around that point. But I want to rotate it around the middle. That just kind of, to me, makes sense. Now if I go back to my animation tool, my transform tool, I'm on frame 1, go out to frame 11, and now if I move this all the way across the screen, we can see it's moving across the screen. And it's following a path. So if I'm at this frame and I move it up here, following a path. Now that path it's following, if we want to see it, we have these little hash mark options up here, and it says show control, and this will show the path that it's animating on. And it's also Command F11 on a Mac, Control F11 if you're on Windows. Now I click and you can see here it's showing me the path that it's going to animate on. Each one of these hash marks represents one of the frames that we have here. Remember that animations change over time. So the more frames that I have, the slower that animation will be. So if I just grab this keyframe in my timeline and move it out to, say, 41, we can see now there's more dots indicating that this animation is now going to go slower. But if I pull this over back to 10, now we can see it goes much faster. It's change over time. That is how animation occurs. So I click on it, let go, then click again, and then I can drag that frame over to get movement or animation to happen. Now if we happen to be at the middle here, I can click and add a keyframe, F6 on my keyboard, or I can just grab my artwork and move it. Now one of the things to keep in mind when we're doing this is if I don't hit F6 to do it and just move it, I've only keyframed the position. because I'm only changing the position. I didn't change rotation, so I haven't changed rotation on any of the keyframes. But if I hit F6, it does put in a keyframe for every single property. So this matters if you're sometimes moving and rotating and scaling all at the same time, that you get weird unexpected results if you just grab, move, scale, rotate, squish, whatever you choose to do. You sometimes will get weird results happening if you are not, actually I want to undo. I'm gonna pull up to here. At this point, we'll scale it out so we can see we have the scale going on as part of it. Now if I say rotate 180 degrees, it's going to rotate that 180 degrees over all of it because there is no keyframe in the middle. If I hit F6, then it would only start the rotation at that prior keyframe. So these are subtleties that you start to learn when you start animating more complex rigged elements and rigged characters. And when you do that, where you have not just a single object with a peg, but you may have a parent-child relationship between multiple pegs and multiple drawing layers, say on a character limb. So an upper arm, a lower arm, and a hand, or upper leg, lower leg, and a foot. And as we put these parts together and work with them, we have to be aware of it. So it's generally considered a good practice to just hit F6 every time you're going to do something, but if you don't, half the time it's not that big a deal. So once again, I can move this up here, and now we're following, look at that, I'm following just a perfect curve. I didn't have to animate the curve, it's just following that curve, and it's doing it beautifully as it works through that animation, which is pretty slick compared to, oh, I want to draw this on each and every frame as I work my way across here. Well, that's kind of difficult. Now, if we want to adjust it so we're not moving evenly here, one thing to keep in mind is maybe I want to get high quick and then slow down as I get towards the top. So what I can do is I can just simply hit F6, it inserts in a keyframe, and then I can move that keyframe closer to the beginning. Now notice how there's fewer frames to get up high, more frames as we get to the top, so we can see how it's slowing it down. Versus on the second half of this arc, it is now following a faster and consistent or linear trajectory. It's moving the same amount each frame. But if I just decide I want to be closer to the end, like this, actually I'll just put a keyframe in here. If I move that keyframe further out so it takes more frame, it's slow and then it goes fast. So what we've effectively done is we've created easing, and let me just stop the animation there, keep it on loop. So you can see how we're able to modify what is happening with it. Now, if I decide I don't like that arc and want to adjust it, I can certainly pull that over there. So we can adjust our animation. So compared to doing our frame-by-frame animation, this is a much faster and easier way to go about what we're trying to do. So it gives us a lot more flexibility, a lot more freedom of movement, because we're no longer confined to, I have to draw it, and 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 draw it. And if I'm doing 700 frames of animation, that takes a long time. I do need to point something out on here. Now, every time you select the artwork, I forget because I have a tool option selected. If you see purple, purple is telling me I've selected the drawing layer. So if I open up and look at what's going on, So I have my peg layer and my drawing layer. The peg layer has the dash P on it. So if I click on this, it shows the drawing layer. But I want, when I'm using the transform tool to animate, I want to only choose the peg, remembering that that's where we want to be putting our keyframes. That's what we need to be controlling. So I click in my tool properties and choose peg selection mode. And when I do that, now if I click on my artwork, it's yellow instead of that kind of magenta pinkish purple color. So I want it to be yellow when I click on it. So I peg selection mode. Now I click, it's yellow. That tells me that when I've selected it, I've created a peg, or I have selected the peg. So anytime I'm animating with the transform tool, I should see yellow. If I don't see yellow and it looks like I've tinted my artwork purple, which if you have artwork that, let's see if I go into this artwork and we just make it a different color. Oh, it's hard to see that green mixed with the purple. Kind of turns weird orange. But we see, look at the frame around it. The frame around it has that pink color. So I'm just going to go back and choose a color. Now also, if you want to make your colors transparent, again, I like the multi-wheel. The single wheel, again, it looks here. I can lower my opacity of my color. But again, I just prefer working in the multi-wheel for my color. So if this is my color, we'll just lighten it up, and hey, look, we're about where it was. Looks good. It's my transparent purple color. So peg selection mode. Now, something else we need to understand about keyframes. There's a line connecting all of these keyframes here. And I'm going to close. When we're animating, we generally only want to see the peg layer. That works much better while we're going about it. But currently, these keyframes has the computer interpolating or calculating what the artwork should be in between my frames. And that's nice because it's helping me to create a smooth animation without having to mark out each frame or every other frame. It's pretty common to put your keyframes no closer than every other. You don't need them on every frame, but you put them on odd numbers. That's often, which we'll learn more about that in coming sessions, is we want our keyframes on odds, and eventually we'll do our animation on twos. But these are what are referred to as motion keyframes. Harmony also supports what are called stop motion keyframes. Now I clicked this. We have these two lines here. One has a squiggle, one has a straight line between it, or we can right click, go down to pull down menus, all of that. Now you'll notice my artwork has straight lines on that path, but nothing's changing on the in between. So it's effectively holding that drawing until it gets to that next. So it's stop motion. Think stop motion animation. We're doing stop motion keyframes. So the computer is not interpolating or calculating and displaying in between artwork for us. So it's common when you're working that sometimes you will use stop motion keyframes and sometimes you will use motion keyframes. Often what happens is in the beginning you use motion keyframes to establish the base of your movement, and then you switch your keyframes to stop motion keyframes during the refinement stage. That is a normal process of working. And we can see when I hit play, it's similar, it's just not as smooth. The nice part is I can just highlight those keyframes, click the button, they go back to being motion keyframes, and it's all there. if you're doing animation that you can use the interpolation for the movement, that's going to greatly speed up your production. But if you realize you're just putting a keyframe every other frame as you go through, you probably are using more keyframes than you need. So ideally you should be able to have larger gaps for bigger movements where you don't have to add in so many frames. Now even these extra frames added in for what is in effect easing, so I'm trying to slow it down as it gets to the top and then speed it up as it comes down. We could even do this without using those extra keyframes and actually just use easing as part of it, but we'll save that for a different day. Right now I want you to get used to using keyframes. Now if you tried to follow along and your keyframes were automatically showing up as standard stop motion keyframes, there is in your preferences, now on Windows it's Edit Preferences, and on Mac it's Harmony Premium. Go to the Harmony menu and choose Preferences. And on General, there's an option right in the middle right of stop motion keyframes. There are times where you want it to default to stop motion keyframes, and there's times where you want it to default to motion keyframes. So you need to pay attention to what your preference setting is. I do believe the default is that it's on motion keyframes, but if when you were trying it was doing stop motion, it wasn't giving you the line between or the interpolation, then check that box. And as always, make sure focus on mouse enter is selected. There's pretty much never a reason not to have that. At least I have yet to discover a time or reason that I would not want that selected. So going into this, I'm just going to eliminate these keyframes and we'll start over. Oh man, missed one. And we'll start over. Now we're going to animate this with a little bit more intention. So do remember we need to have peg selection mode active with our transform tool. And when we're doing the animation, what I want to do is we're going to do it kind of, if I want it to say animate this as a bouncing ball. To do that, I could just use straight ahead animation, so I have my first frame. Now if I want to add a little bit of anticipation, so we're doing the preparatory before I jump or bounce, if I shrink this down, notice how it's shrinking down from both the top and bottom because it's scaling it based on that pivot point. First thing I'm going to do is just add in a new layer. I'm just going to call it ground so I have something to reference on it. We'll just close that and let me just use my line tool. Use black on my line tool, and now I have a line to follow. Now we can see I happen to be on frame 3 when I drew that, so we'll go back to frame 1, go out to frame 120, hit F5 to extend out the exposure to that layer. I'm going to just stick that layer down underneath because I always feel like it should be below. And since I'm not working with this layer and it's not animating, I don't need to add a peg to it, but I'm going to lock it. Notice when I lock it, it turns red. And I just do that so that I can't accidentally ever, I can't select it as I'm trying to do stuff. It doesn't work. But I can now select my artwork here, and we can see where that sits in relation to the ground. Oh, that's at the end of the frame, don't want that. Let's go back to frame 1 where we're supposed to be. Let's try again. Okay. So now we've set it. So if I want to do my anticipation, remembering that we can permanently change pivot points using the advanced animation tools, but I want to do a temporary change. So when I put my cursor over the pivot point, we get the little P on it, indicating it's going to adjust the pivot point. If I click out here, it moves it. if I want to adjust the pivot point, I can just pull that pivot point down to the ground. So now, starting in frame 1, I'm going to go over to frame 3. We'll hit F6 to insert a keyframe. And now, if I scale this down, we can see how the ground is staying consistent. Now, as it's scaling down, it needs to get a little bit wider. So we can see that difference happening. This is part of that anticipation, building up for the movement. Moving into the next frame, or going over to frame 5, what I'm going to do is scale it up again. This time it's getting ready to launch. Alright, so frame 1, oh, because I must not have selected it, we'll just select so we can see how we now have this anticipation getting ready to jump. Now, going to go over a few more frames. Or no, maybe we'll just go over 2 more frames and pull this up as part of it. But what we really want is to go, okay, I'm going to land here. And let's move that over and kind of get a sense of if we're going to jump. Now it's only jumping just kind of a little bit. I want it to jump higher. So go here, F6, go somewhere in the middle, F6, and let's pull it up. Now let's check our. Now, you may notice that we're maintaining our weird squash shape all the way through. So that is a problem. I probably should have fixed it at the end before I added it in the middle, but it's easy enough to address. Now remember I said it's temporary, and you may be going, well, that pivot point is staying at the bottom. But if I click off, now click back on, we'll see how the pivot point is not at the bottom, but it's back to its original. So it still remembers its permanent pivot point. Now if we compare that, that looks pretty close to what's here. And it's okay to have it as it's stretching down to the ground, and then a couple frames later at this point we need to put in a little bit of squash and stretch. So with that we can F6, but I do need to now move the pivot point down to the ground where it's hitting as it's landing. And now we go back here, F6, to the original position. We hit play. We now have squash and stretch, we have anticipation, and follow through, all of our core principles of animation. Now what's nice is I can select these frames and go, you know, why don't we give it a little bit more time? Move that out. Now select those 3, move them out, move our stop point here out a little bit more. Now let's check. Alright. Well, I feel I went a little too far, so let's go back and see. And I think that's a little bit closer to what I want. Let's try. Alright. Select these 3 frames. So I highlight, take my hand off the mouse button, or pick my stylus up. Let's highlight it. Oh. I wanted to move all 3. Let's try that again. And now I can click and drag, maintaining an approximate equal stretch of frames. So when you look at this arc, you may go, gee, you know, it'd be nice if that arc was, oh, I don't know, a little bit more up. And now if I click off, I'm rotated around the center, because what I want to do during this is put a little bit of rotation in. And as we come back down, let's go back 1 frame. Yeah, right about there. You have some rotation, but also on these frames, if I adjust their position, we can smooth out the shape of the arc to create a much more elegant and pleasing shape, so it's not moving in 2 straight lines. So by utilizing keyframes, I'm able to animate much faster, because if I had to hand draw each one of these and then try to get them all look the same shape, so that it doesn't look all like weird, you know, it takes a lot of practice to have your lines line up on each frame. But by using the computer's ability to do interpolation, we're able to now generate pretty smooth animation in a relatively short window of time, which I would argue is going to make your life a whole lot more fun. So good luck, and have fun with this new way of animating.